Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogue Season 3, Episode 1. I'm Daniel Helmig. We're already in our third season. If you did not have the chance to check out the other two, I invite you to do so. Season 1 is focused on topics we as well cover in our services, but no worries, there are no sales pitches, just genuine dialogues of how to assess where company stands on topics such as supply chain, procurement, cash flow, sustainability, digitalization, process mining, employee satisfaction, and organizational design. Well, quite a mouthful. Season 2 was then already honing in on greenhouse gas emission reduction in supply chains, with excursions into visions, game theories, surviving and thriving in and after the first 90 days on the job, and even a dip into the gaming industry market. Now in this season, Season 3, we will focus even further on the wide aspects of greenhouse gas emission reductions via supply chain changes. We will discuss recent academic papers that give you the one view most practitioners are missing when making decisions. This is called evidence-based management theory, by the way, and sprinkle in interviews with interesting people that have a lot to say about the art of the possible on managing the triple bottom line, which is profit, people, and planet. As always, feel free to send us a note to dialogues@helmigadvisory.com, one word, with recommendations and or critique of past episodes. Now, let's get on with the show. So this episode is about the steel market and especially the developments in green steel. Green steel is, as you probably have guessed, not defined by its greenish color, but by a significant reduction of the greenhouse gas emission produced in this high-energy production process. We are lucky to have nearly an hour with Felix Schmitz, CEO of Klöckner Metals in Germany. Klöckner Metals does not produce, but buy and sell steel. They have a brilliant overview of the market all over the world, and I can promise you that you will find Felix's insights fascinating. So, Felix, first, congratulations. It's a little bit long ago already, but last year you have been appointed CEO of Klöckner Metals in Germany. Quite a fascinating job, specifically in today's world, a world in which something which is called iron and carbon that can be traced back to Damascus steel, 900 BCE, still is being produced and requires a significant rethinking in terms of how we are going to use steel in the future. About 2 billion tons of steel are being produced, as far as I know today, and it seems that about 7 to 11% of the total greenhouse gas emissions come from that production overall. So it's a sizable amount of industry, 6 million people being employed globally. So you're doing good as well for the overall job market. But before we get into the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions and what we can do about it, why don't you just tell me a little bit in terms of where you come from and why you choose such a job that you have today?
Yes, of course. First of all, thanks for having me and thanks for your congratulations. It's an exciting job, an exciting challenge, and more specifically in one of the most exciting sectors of this world, I have to say. I was starting out somewhere else. I was starting in financial services a few years ago and joined Klöckner back then in 2017. So around 7 years ago, and worked in the investor relations department. Klöckner & Co., the group, is a listed company and the headquarters in Western Germany. And I was heading the investor relation department for quite a while and took on another role 3 years ago, a second central department for the entire group, which is called, or still called, is strategic sustainability. So there you can already see we have a very strategic perspective on sustainability topics. We did it with lots of dedication. About myself, well, I'm a father of 3 children. I'm not just interested in having lots of excitement on the job, but also off the job. And I'm a sports guy. So I was once a referee for football, having to concentrate myself, not calling it soccer, of course. And besides that, this has never changed. And so I'm very excited about football and also other sports stuff. And now I'm the biggest fan of my children. who start playing football.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, beside the excitement of the job, it's always good to have a couple of kids at home to ground yourself in terms of what's really important in life. Just to ground the people a little bit in who and what Klöckner Metals Germany and Klöckner overall as a group is doing. Would you mind giving us a little bit of context about this company that has a sales of about 9.4 billion, as far as I understand, in 2022 and about 90,000 customers worldwide? Tell us a little bit about the group.
So first of all, one has to understand that we are not a steel and metal producer. We are a distributor. So we procure lots of metal from around 60 main suppliers in the Western world. And we sell it to around 60,000, more than 60,000 customers. We have around 190,000 products at stock. And so there you can already see it's managing complexity. And of course, steel is not that easy to handle like a very small package for Amazon or such things. So it's a different kind of business. Our main markets and core markets are Central Europe and North America. So we had a very big divestment just recently. We divested our country organizations in UK, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So our core market in Europe remains Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. Besides that, we are focusing very much on US, America, and Mexico recently. So what does a steel and metal distributor do? We are managing complexity for our customers who have barely the chance to get that kind of procurement power into place. And we give them the broad range of metal products that they need to fulfill their customers' dreams. And we take lots of metal on stock. So we buy it, bring it into our warehouses. We have around 120 of them in the markets I just called up, and our salespeople with lots of know-how about the sectors they are serving, bring it then to the customers. Besides that, it's not just storing metal. We are driving down the value chain pretty much. So we are not just processing the material, we are doing higher value added business with the material, which is in fact nothing else than pre-production and coming very close to assembly. So we weld it from time to time. We laser it with 3D lasers so that our customers can save lots of time, also lots of money if they focus on what they can do best and leave the rest to others like us.
And I think specifically for the topic that we are as well getting into, this is even more interesting because you consolidate your focus demand. And then with your buying power, you can as well change markets or basically drive markets. Yeah,
absolutely.
So
absolutely. We saw it globally.
Yeah.
So that means also that we, against the perspective of our customers from time to time, have the entire global steel production market in our focus. So we believe, and I truly believe, that there is nothing happening in steel out there which we don't know of, especially in terms of green steel.
Which will help us for our discussion today because we have a really knowledgeable person here. Very good. So let's dig a little bit into the subject of the podcast. I've been personally familiar with steel for the last 30 years on all continents as chief procurement officer for different companies as such, or working basically in the automotive industry as well for 20 years. I know it's a fiercely competitive market, and with high capex and opex cost, technology can be a major differentiator if done right. And you could see that in the past when China basically set up, for example, new steel mills while the rest of the world was still utilizing their old ones at that point in time. They had an efficiency gap produced, which helped them even that we could ship China steel across the world, and it was actually profitable. So technology is big. And today, everyone seems to be racing towards finding the holy grail, which is now green steel. What is the Klöckner's definition of green steel? How do you define it for yourself?
Well, that is a good question, and I will answer it in a minute, but I would like to start somewhere else. So to get everybody on board, how we perceive this topic and why we are perceiving it differently than other players in the market. So first of all, one has to understand, and you described it implicitly to a certain extent at least, the steel industry as such has gained a somewhat bad reputation over time. A somewhat dusty good. It's a dusty production route that we're following. And in terms of sustainability, everybody knows there's lots of CO2 along the way of production. And then the steel industry gained further a rather critical perception in the market since the financial crisis in 2008, because the market became under pressure. You already mentioned the Chinese production took up very sharply, and that set markets overall in the world under pressure. And lots of steel companies were struggling since then. But what we forget about is how important steel is. So if everybody just imagines what the world would look like without steel, there are not so many other materials in this world who are so much key for the production of different goods. So we wouldn't talk, you wouldn't sit, I wouldn't stand, all these kind of things wouldn't be happening right now in the surrounding we are talking together. That is the first thing. Second thing, I was talking about the bad reputation in terms of CO2. We did not used to know a lot about CO2 a few years ago. Everybody just knew, if I want to produce steel, this goes along with lots of CO2 emissions. That is something everybody knows. But nobody really took on comparisons. Nobody really tried to compare steel with other substitutes, for instance. But we are a trader, a distributor. And we really try to step outside and try to compare different materials. What is the competitive and comparative advantage of the production of the product versus other products? And then we saw there might be an opportunity in it, also considering that the substitution of steel in total is not possible. And that was the day when we started to elaborate a dedicated sustainability strategy. That was in 2020 and 2021. At the same time, we signed up to the Science Based Targets initiative to get our decarbonization targets approved. And all of a sudden, also with good timing, we became the first player globally who had its SBTi targets under the new regulation approved back then. But this is a process that was very important for us as a group, because you get this fine sense of what greenwashing looks like and what real decarbonization initiatives look like. And that came all together. And then in 2021, there was a big shift in the industry, because for the first time, there was a commercial sense to it. There were bigger producers out there who were not just talking about their own decarbonization initiatives, but also tried to put it into products and commercially brought it into the market. Back then, it was still the case that we were talking about scope 1 and 2 emissions when talking about products. Now we know all better. But that was the day it all started. And we, as a distributor, came to the conclusion that steel is difficult to substitute. It is recyclable. You can decarbonize it materially over time. And very importantly, it is relatively cheap. And this was the perfect mix for a business model. And that is what we took on. We perceive this as a business model. If you do the decarbonization by switching off the lights when you go at home, you might feel better when you fall asleep, but this is not saving our planet. It is business modeling. It is rationality that is really pushing us forward. And that is what we took on, basically. Your question was another one. Your question was, how do we define green steel? But that was the start of the journey. We simply asked ourselves in this time, what is green steel everybody's talking about? What is it? There are so many frictions, so many categorizations, so many hierarchies you would have to have in mind, and nobody had a clue. Then people were planting trees in Brazil and said, our steel is carbon negative. That sounds good, doesn't it? And all these kind of things were things we try to analyze. And the outcome was pretty clear. There are already, and have been already back then, clear frameworks in place. And then we asked ourselves, what does a production route look like? And of course, as a distributor of steel with decades of know-how, we know as much about steel as the producers know about steel themselves. And we came along with a pretty straightforward definition of different shades of greenish steel. So there is, and that is, I think, the most important thing, not the green steel at all. There are different steps of decarbonizing your steel product. And this is not starting and not ending at zero. There is no zero in this world. And that was quite a journey for us. We ruled out, for instance, offsetting tactics, crediting, all the kind of things that already were implemented in the frameworks of the GHG protocol, of the ISO standards of back then. And this sounds like it would have been 20 years ago. Nobody talked about it. Honestly, we had discussions with suppliers who wanted to say that their footprint is scope 1 and 2 related, but nothing else. But we all know better now.
True to that. Interesting. Thank you as well for doing a little bit of an excursion in terms of explaining the whole situation in total. I'm a big proponent of scope 3 as such. 60 to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions happen in the supply chain. And so therefore, if we are able to utilize this, and there I fully agree with you, we should talk more about business solutions and less about governmental regulations with regard to this. You can, with just the forces of the market competition, get to a pretty good state with regard to greenhouse gas emission reduction if you want to. Fully with you. Let's base a little bit the numbers that we are talking about. What carbon footprint has 1 ton of normal steel, and where do you see the tonnage that you would like to see for a, as you call it, greenish steel?
The best answer to it will be it depends. When we started to analyze the carbon load of steel, we came to the conclusion that the general normalized number of carbon steel in this world seems to be higher than what you read in the newspapers. It might be related to scope 3 issues. Sure. We don't know. It might be the global footprint, whatever. We came to the conclusion that the usual number is at around 2.5 for carbon steel, not talking about stainless right now, and not talking about other metals like aluminum, which is even higher. And then we tried to look up what current technologies and also technologies that are on the horizon would be able to contribute to the decarbonization of that very product. And we found that a critical decarbonization took place if you reach a mark of around 1,750. So 1 ton and 750 kilos of CO2 per ton of steel. Then you already achieved a lot. But there are different other techniques to decarbonize the product that you have. And you might find yourself in a position one day, if you produce steel with H2 and with fully renewable energy, that you make it below the 400 kilos per ton of steel. And that is already a lot. And if you now reconcile to what we said earlier, steel is everywhere. And steel has lots of CO2 at the moment. That means for the bill of material, so the sum of CO2 that is in an end product, it will be always material. That sounds like a burden. You're coming from steel procurement. You know what I want to talk about. So if you turn it around, and if you're able to decarbonize this big bulk of supply chain related CO2 content, you will decarbonize the end product. And that is what it is all about. The product that is at the end of the cycle, you will decarbonize it substantially, way more than with focusing on other materials. And to be honest, if we talk about decarbonization, if we talk about climate change, we are talking also about focus, and we are also talking about timing. And we should not lose time. And if you want to not waste time, everybody should start, if possible, at the highest carbon load immediately. And in very often times, this is basically steel.
I'm with you on that. As you mentioned, my former profession and passion to some extent as well. My point as a supply chain officer or chief procurement officer was always, okay, when we had a certain target that we wanted to achieve, whether it was cost, quality, whatever. Okay, let's look at the total amount of categories that we buy. And if we have an issue on one, because it might be a long-term change that we have to do, and we have to focus on other categories in the meantime and get there. What we will talk about is how long it will take to change steel production towards the maybe 400 kilogram that you were talking about. And that's a long journey. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't start on that, as you said, and we should start right now, so that by 2050, we get to a point that we are actually somewhere. One has to as well see that as it looks like right now, in the next 10, 15 years, there is still a significant increase in terms of steel production overall globally. So therefore, there are other forces that are working against this. So we have to start now. I'm fully with you on that.
Absolutely. And what you have to consider is that if we learned something in the last years, we know that there is no zero anymore. We have this greenwashing directive, at least on European level. I think everybody also in private life learned a lot about decarbonization and climate change throughout the last years. And we all know now, especially in company surrounded fields, that double-digit decarbonization rates are already a lot. And the good thing, this is achievable today. This is not a question of tomorrow or 10 years or so. There is something achievable today.
Yep.
And it is not about a company itself. So if you simply have to restrict yourself and maybe have to take the money from your shareholders, for instance, it makes your way more difficult. The good thing is, and that is something I mentioned earlier, is there are business models. You can earn something from it and you can finance your way if you do it smartly. And that is something we know now.
True to that. Now, you mentioned as well that you were, and that's part of your business, so therefore you analyzed all the different ways of how steel production can be done in detail. So if you look at the different ways that green steel can be produced, what do you think has the best chance of long-term survival to actually take over? Do you have a preference on that?
As of today, and we're talking about the year 2024, the answer will certainly point to a mix of all technologies that are out there. But we have seen so many developments in this field throughout the last years. It might be something fully different in 10 years' time arising in the market. And I would not rule it out. In the end, there is one target: producing the same quality of steel with less carbon. And you talked about the Holy Grail green steel. The Holy Grail green steel was in the last years very much linked with H2 produced or by H2 produced steel. But there are so many multiple high technology solutions out there. So the electronic arc furnace that is in the current surrounding already able to produce very high quality steels with way less CO2 footprint. One should not rule it out and one should not fight against it. If somebody is not from steel and listening to our conversation right now and saying there is demand for a decarbonized product which you can sell with a margin, and the decarbonization potential is already something you can carry away today, this looks like a dream scenario, but that is how you have to perceive it. This is a very good scenario which other sectors would love to have, but you have to play it like this, and you have to have the confidence to also teach your customers and the entire industry what it is about greenwashing, about what this makes for your customer's product, what it does to your customer's product, and what it finally does. And these conversations also take place in our business, what it does to the customer's products. And you have to talk to all of them. If they understand, this is a consulting and a educational task. If you understand this and make your customers understand it, it is an easy game. I told it before, I'm not from sustainability. I did something else in the past. And that is something pretty logic. But you have to have the confidence and you have to be willing to talk about it and to define and to learn over and over again.
I'm fully with you. And I think, as you mentioned, you're not from sustainability, but you're a father. And I think everyone who looks at the facts that are in front of us and thinks that climate change is real and that there is a correlation towards greenhouse gas emissions, looking at this in the next generation and the generation after that. And when you then look at the scenarios that are being drawn today, that's not going to be a pretty life for these if we are not changing. Again, it's stating the obvious. Now, but you mentioned already your clients. There is, in the press, there is stuff about, okay, who is using green steel right now? And you mentioned as well already H2, and they are providing now for prototypes, which is the smallest amount of steel that you have for prototypes for Volvo. Where do you have a demand for green steel today already?
Absolutely. So we have to consider that the substantially decarbonized material is still scarce. We are not talking about the H2 route. By the way, one has to distinguish between H2 green steel, that is one of the drivers from Sweden, a producer who has made lots of way from scratch. They are building great things, the H2 route. And the H2 route is still somewhat away, but we're going to get there pretty soon. When it comes to overall greenish products, there is still scarcity in the market, but this is good, to be honest, to tease the market and demand. We as Klöckner had already greenish transactions with construction, automotive, mechanical engineering, shipbuilding, metal transforming, basically all the sectors we are serving. And we learned a lot from these transactions. Most importantly, the biggest learning we took from these transactions is how important it is to tell the customer what the benefit of this purchase means for her or for him. If you talk to a metal procurement employee, they are going to tell you, well, this will be very expensive, right? So there are so many billions running, of course. There's so many billions of dollars running into the transformation of facilities. That is the misconception in this overall concept. Of course, the transformation of a steel production site costs a lot of money, but this is not true for the end product price increase that is linked to greenish steel. We had a study, and that was also back in 2021, coming from the Boston Consulting Group, who made the equation and said, what does it mean for the end product price? What does it mean for the customer? What does it mean commercially if I procure green steel? It would mean, and that is something we already discussed, a substantial decarbonization of my overall end product. But does it also mean that I have to pay a lot for this? No, I don't have to. This is why it's so important to understand the very specific business model of steel. For instance, if you have an EV and you buy green steel and you produce the EV, the electric vehicle, with green steel, you will have an estimated end product price increase of less than 1%. Less than 1%. The question, of course, is the end customer willing, in the times of climate change, to pay more than 1% for this greenish or CO2 reduced EV? I would say, of course. And the same is true for washing machines, for dryers, for wind energy. If you buy green steel for a wind energy farm, you will be able to decarbonize the offshore wind park by 85%.
Yes.
The end product price increase is 5.5%. The question, Daniel, for you is, are you willing to buy greenish power from a grayish offshore wind farm? Does it make sense? It does not. And a few years later, 2 years later, there was a new study coming in who was dedicated to the end customer willingness to pay for that price increase that was lower than everybody thought, not 2 billion per product, but rather a few euros. And the interesting thing is that most means more than 50% of the people are already today very much willing and highly likely buying at a higher price and buying for a higher price. And that is the impetus that is coming for the leaders of the world in the industries to follow along these tracks, because there isn't a business model. There's not a must that you have to restrict yourself. There is a business related, commercial, logical impetus.
Felix, I did this whole procurement stuff now for nearly 40 years, and clearly there were a lot of innovations, a lot of changes that were needed. I was still part of an ISO 9000 revolution in terms of the quality, where we started from shitty vehicles to vehicles that you could actually drive and that last for a while, or that the toasters did not explode in your kitchen. And the argument is always the same. It's going to be more expensive. And what I've learned over the 4 decades is, yes, it is starting to be expensive at the beginning because market forces drive a certain amount of higher margins for the market entrants that are there beforehand. But over time, the market forces lead to a reduction to a price that is either at the same mark or at something which is absolutely okay in the market setup. So therefore, the product as such doesn't have to be more expensive. And we have done that over and over and over again. We're good at that as humans. And we will do the same thing as well when it comes to steel and what it will cost. One additional point, and you mentioned at the beginning, I mean, I read that the investment for this H2 Green in Sweden is about 1.5 billion euro for a plant like that. Just to give as well listeners who are into this environment and they know a little bit about the cost, I was in the semiconductor industry for a couple of years. An average semiconductor plant in the front end costs 2 to 3 billion. And it leads to the fact that we actually reduce overall cost because you have much higher volumes, and so therefore the degradation in terms of cost effect is as well large. And so when we look at steel and we talk about 1.5 billion, we think it's so massive. It's not.
We have to be true to ourselves. There are a lot of investments to be made. There are a lot of steel sites in this world, but absolutely, when it comes to prioritizing, when it comes to effectiveness of decarbonizing the industry, it is the core path to take.
Absolutely. In one of my last podcasts, I had a game theorist and economist on the show. He pointed out that the incentive of engaging in green steel for most companies is relatively minor due to the high prices we talked about, and in combination with the free rider effect and the minimal cost of doing nothing currently. What would it take to bring the price of green steel, if at all possible, to a comparable level as today's green steel?
I think the question is the wrong question. So should we bring it down? You said it a few minutes earlier, that of course the transformation of industry is costing money. And this is not going to change. So this will persist. The question is, of course, what is going to happen if we don't do it, right? I mean, we know. And it is also about licenses to operate. It is about truthfulness in operating. Not so much about ethics, by the way. It's pretty logic. Then rather, it is a question how much, and carbon is nothing else. Carbon is nothing else than money at this point in time. How much time do you have till gray steel will be more expensive than green steel? And this is going to happen. Of course, one day. This is rather sooner than later. This is also something steel purchasers have to ask themselves. I said it, it's a scarce material with not so many players being currently able to handle their supply chains, also in terms of transparency, to make clear what is green and what is not green. If you want to have a foot in the door when it gets more severe, we believe you should rather act today. And we are perceived as a player of the steel industry. But Daniel, the truth is, we are a steel purchaser ourselves. We have SBTi targets. By the way, just as we talked, we already reached with the 2023 numbers for scope 1 and 2, our SBTi 2030 goals of reducing it by 50%. So we stick to what we want to achieve. but we are still also a customer of the steel industry. So we really look at it from the customer point of view. And I think this is also the sweet spot where we are in currently. We are not producing it, but we know what it is about. And still we are a customer related and customer close steel purchaser. And therefore I simply believe that we see it a bit earlier. And we would like to share this gain, this experience with our customers.
Congratulations for achieving your targets already that early. I think
Thank you
this
very
is
proud of it.
fantastic. Yes,
Yeah.
and you should be, clearly. And I announced from every roof that I have the ability to stand that if you put your focus and your mind to it, you are able to much quicker get to your targets. But it takes as well people like you, for example, CEOs of the organization, to declare that a CO2 target is equal to the other targets that one has, like cost, revenue, quality, and what have you. In a lot of companies, that's not the case. You have the board of directors, the management board declaring, okay, we still go with our normal targets because that's what our board of directors is saying. And then you have the rest of the organization who's trying to scramble by with all the other targets that are being thrown at them from regulators and from society. It takes the CEO to say, and the buck stops with me, we're not doing it.
You're absolutely right. It starts from the top. Our group CEO, Guido Kerkhoff, put it into the remuneration scheme 2 years ago. And of course, at the beginning, everybody was thinking, what is going to happen now? Are we going to achieve this? And now we have had the second year since it found entrance into the scheme, and we are moving. And we also see big customers, listed groups who have implemented equal things in their remuneration scheme of the top management. And of course, it is working. It is not broad-based at the moment, but I'm pretty sure it will be very soon.
Yeah. And for every purchaser today who is listening into the podcast, there is nothing that prevents you of actually taking the first step and putting it into your RFQ documents that this is an order winner. It will be at some point in time an order qualifier, maybe in 10, 15, 20 years, but right now it's should be an order winner. So just go ahead. You can with a hero not only in your company, but as well at home. You can talk about this probably as well.
Absolutely. I'm happy to take your calls. And one more, you're going to learn a lot. So the educational stuff just starts if you ask for it. And secondly, we talked about the potential of steel in this bill of material. The purchasers in the steel category will be the superstars of the next years. That is clear. The decarbonization is coming from that end.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you want to be superstars, now it's the time to get into that. That's fantastic.
Call us at Klöckner.
Absolutely. I talked at some point in time earlier briefly about governments and as well the role and that markets should drive as much as possible the trend towards decarbonization. But let's take a step back. The way to increase green materials or reduce carbon is quite different between if you look at Europe or the US. Europe focuses more on carbon trade process and restrictions, in my view. So far during the presidency of Biden, he acts more as an administration that investing, especially in so-called brown industries, like, for example, steel, to give them the financial wind under their wings to make investments in new greener technologies. What is your view on subsidies to build more green steel production facilities and via economies of scale, reducing pricing and make it more affordable for everyone?
So you framed it a bit like the US is focusing on old dusty industries while Europe is doing it a bit differently. My perception is, and covering both continents, or at least have covered them, both of them, Europe is very much into regulation currently. We as a listed group, but also what medium-sized entities will have to fulfill in the very near future, already have to fulfill today, is massive. We are talking about the CSDD, the CSRD, Lieferkettengesetz in German. So there are lots of things that are, from a broader perspective, a good thing to have, but if you dive into it, it's a massive blow to the organizations. Mm-hmm. The US is investing especially into what I would say energy, very straightforward. So there's lots of money for the solar energy, wind energy, and such things. And I believe that this is smart because we are talking about green steel or greenish steel, CO2 reduced steel, what we call it. We talk about transformation, climate change, and decarbonization. In the end, it's always, that is something we already decided about, it's always a question of energy. And I think that lots of things should go into that direction. And I think the US is doing it a bit more dedicated. I don't want to talk about nuclear right now, all these kind of things. I think this would go too far. But if you look into the direction and the focus of what the different geographies are currently concentrating on, there is a mindset shift. And I'm not saying that regulation is not needed. We ourselves, of course, believe if a government wakes up and says, if you want to build a building, build it decarbonized or CO2 reduced or so, this might be certainly also good to tease certain dynamics. But the overall framework couldn't be more different right now.
That's as well my perception. And the question is whether this is going to really help so much more in the future. If you look at the main 40 countries that have the highest CO2 emissions, there are about 250 different regulations already available with regard to CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. And if you try to supply to these markets, that means that you have to follow 250 slightly different, sometimes massively different standards to get things done. Even in the automotive industry, which normally was the pivoting with regard to having similar kind of standards, is right now nowhere near a good setup of common standards. So that is something that we have to deal with today and unfortunately as well in the future. I hope that we will get to a point that as well regulators will realize that if you set swim lanes with regulations, which are needed, you can step back. You don't have to tell the people how they have to swim and then let markets and competitive forces basically do their say.
And it's happening. So SBDI, for instance, that was something we have not been forced to join. Not at all. That is something we simply did because we found ourselves responsible as an international acting company and that many, many other big companies are following. Regulations is of course a force with all good and bad.
Felix, in the pre-discussions that we had before the podcast, you talked a lot about transparency. This is a big thing for you, and you have done a lot with regard to creating transparency. Would you mind talking a little bit about this from the Klöckner Metal perspective?
Yes, of course. So one has to understand that there is no CO2 reduced steel in this world if there is no transparency about the greenishness of the material. So if we know that it was CO2 reduced produced, we still don't know what the carbon content looks like. And it is clear that due to the very sharp dynamic throughout the last years, producers had a very hard stance to come up with the transparency for every single product. I said earlier in the call that we at Klöckner serve our customers with around 190,000 products. If we would have to have the PCF, the product carbon footprint for every single product, and would therefore need a single EPD or such things, it would take us decades before we have this transparency. But the transparency is key for the decarbonization and the transformation we and the industry is undertaking. Therefore, we said around 2 years ago that it would be very interesting for us to develop what we call PCF algorithm, something that systematically enables us and therefore our customers to gain transparency in a very invisible world. So we, of course, had no hard try getting the PCF for the greenest materials. No doubt about that. Every producer has lots of interest in releasing transparency there. But for the broadness of material, this was a challenge. So what we did is we developed together with the TÜV, a German third-party certifier, and with the help of BCG, a system that enables us to logically and certifiable calculate the footprint, the product carbon footprint, following the ISO 14067 standards for every single product. And it took us a while, more than a year, to bring this to life. But the outcome was great, because we then do not just have the possibility to offer our customers the transparency for every product piece they are buying at Klöckner. They are also able to include it in their bill of material, and therefore bring visibility and transparency into their production processes. And at the same time, we are having enough transparency to offer our customers next door decarbonizations. So not just the greenest of the greenest material is in reach for them if they source at Klöckner. We can tell them today, your sourcing in terms of CO2 content is inefficient. Look at the data, look at what we have, look at what we can compare. And then you see that it is easy for you on article level to switch to a different product, which is the same article, and you're going to achieve already double-digit decarbonization potentials. And there you can see these are two different pillars. The one is sourcing CO2-reduced steel. The other is transparency. There is a big overlap, but there are two different pillars in it. And there is also, and that is something I would like to highlight, there is a huge opportunity in transparency. And that is something we see. Of course, this visibility, this transparency is a value, not just for us, also for our customers. So we are commercializing it, but there are no hard questions coming from our customers, because even if they do not want to actively commercialize decarbonization, they at least want to have transparency.
Absolutely. But this is huge. And there's this old saying, what you cannot measure, you cannot control. Felix, thank you very much for being on the show today. It was a pleasure talking with you. And I wish you all the best in your new job, but as well for Klöckner on your trail to green steel and reducing carbon emissions in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Supply Chain Dialogues. If you did, please tell a colleague, friend, and/or decision maker. And for this episode specifically, share it with the steel buyers and procurement heads in your company. Green steel is huge as a carbon emission reduction tool in your Scope 3, where it really matters to all of us the most. Stay safe, be bold, and see you in 2 weeks. These are the Supply Chain Dialogues produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory AG in 2024.